Okay, now we're going to look at sociology as a science. We're going to go through a little bit about the research and the process by which sociology is a science. So this may not always be for everybody the most exciting part, but it is what justifies the research as being valid, reputable, and credible. So why is sociological research even necessary? There are many ways of knowing. However, science has some fundamental ways to address differences and gain understanding. So let's review. Science is empirical. Now this means that knowledge is best gained by direct, systematic observation, not by guessing and not by bias. Scientific knowledge is systematic and public. If it can't be public or verified, it's not accepted. Science has a built-in mechanism for self-correction by creating a hypothesis and then testing them. So a hypothesis is a tentative statement of the relationship between two or more concepts or variables. And there isn't a right or a wrong, and your research doesn't have to prove you right or wrong. You can be wrong and still gain knowledge, and that's important. And lastly, science is objective to ensure that scientists' biases and values do not affect their research. Now, there's more than one type of research. We could look at descriptive studies, where they describe social reality or provide facts about some group, practice, or event. Or we could do explanatory. Explanatory studies try to explain the relationship or to provide information on why certain events do or do not occur. And in addition, we could do a deductive approach where the researcher begins with a theory and then uses research to test the theory. Or you could do the inductive approach. And this is where the researcher collects data and then generates theories from the analysis of those data. So it's wide and varied as to how research can be done, but it does follow a very scientific and systematic approach. All right, let's look at sociological research process. There'll be some definitions here. Quantitative is an objectively studied data that can be measured numerically. Research data about how many of a certain age, race, sex, education, or income. It's countable and it's verifiable and therefore controls bias. Qualitative, it's an interpretative description, words, discovery of an underlying meaning or patterns of social relationships. Interpretive descriptions, words from interviews, observations, surveys, questionnaires. Qualitative research model. Now we're going to go through the stages here, and one of the first things they do is they select and define the research problem. Now that's not always easy to do, so they consider their personal experience and social issues that occur around them, and they ask lots of questions to try to narrow down their topic, if you will, for research. Secondly, they review other research that has been done in the area of their interest. What's been done before? This assists them with narrowing down topics further. Now we're going to look at some more terms. Now first they formulate a hypothesis. Now a hypothesis is a tentative statement of the relationship between two or more concepts or variables. Now let's define some of these things a little further too. Because what we're going to look at is what is a variable. And now it's a concept with measurable traits or characteristics that vary from one person or one time or one situation or society to another. Now there's two types. There's an independent variable. Now an independent variable is a variable that is presumed to cause or determine a dependent variable. Now you might be wondering, what's a dependent variable? A dependent variable, that's a variable that is assumed to depend or to be caused by an independent variable. It's the relationship of cause and effect. Now, in order to do good research, you need to have what's called an operational definition, which is to take the abstract ideas and put them into terms that can be observed and counted. So a clear and understandable definition is important. Fourth is the development of a research design. Now, whether they're choosing experiments or surveys or research or field research or secondary analysis of data, the researcher must evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of each before deciding on their research design to determine which would be the best for their design. Fifth, collect and analyze the data. Now, with this one, there's a couple of things important. Reliability, the extent to which the research instruments, field data and such, yields consistent results. It has to be consistent. And validity, the extent in which the research instrument accurately measures what it is that it's supposed to measure. Then we move on to 6, drawing conclusions and reporting the findings. Now, this is where, after analyzing all the data, researchers first draw conclusions that relate to the data, to the hypothesis. Then they report their findings, which allows for replication, other researchers to do the same and to see if they get the same results. Replication is the repetition of the investigation in substantially the same way that was originally conducted, and they should be getting a very similar result. Now, qualitative research model, that's a little different. Although, the same underlying topic is involved, or logic, is involved, in both qualitative and quantitative, sociological research, the styles of these two are pretty different. The qualitative research is more likely to be used where the research question does not easily lend itself to numbers and statistical methods. The researcher begins with a general rather than a detailed plan. Secondly, the researcher has to decide when literature review and theory application should take place. And then thirdly, the study yields a detailed view of the topic, fewer cases, possibly one, and many variables. Usually it's a little more detailed, a little more descriptive, and it's often generated through interviews and through description of use of words. Well, when we think of research methods, there's a variety. How do sociologists decide which research method to use? And how and why are some approaches better than others? Well, the research methods are strategies or techniques for conducting research, and we're going to review the methods. Please review, the strengths and weaknesses of each, as that's what helps decide which they need and for which and how they focus their topics. So the first one we look at are experiments. Now, experiments is a carefully designed situation in which the researcher studies the impact of certain variables on subjects, attitudes, or behaviors. And it can be either the experimental group or the test group, which contains the subjects who are exposed to the independent variable, or it's the control group, which contains subjects who are not exposed to the independent variables, and then it's compared at the end to see what impact that independent variable had. It's the simplest of experimental designs. One, all subjects are pre-tested. They're measured in terms of the dependent variable. The subjects are in the experimental group are then exposed to a stimulus, the independent variable. The subjects are all subjects are post-tested or remeasured in terms of the dependent variable. And then we see you can see the example in your textbook on page 36. Would you help another person? Now, other famous examples of these sorts of tests are the Milgram's experiment, the Ausch conformity experiment, or the Zimbardo prison experiment. Well, survey research is a method of perhaps that's most often associated with sociology, a research method in a manner in which number of respondents are asked identical questions through a systematic questionnaire or interview. And then respondents, well, those are people who provide the data for analysis through interviews or questionnaires. Survey research involves some type of sampling. So the population is the research in the research study, those persons about whom we want to know or want to be able to draw some conclusions about. And we draw a sample from the population. These are people who are selected from the population to be studied. And a representative sample can be a sample that has essentially the same characteristics of the larger population. And then we randomly sample from the population. Persons are selected entirely by chance or randomly. Now, field research is a study of social life that is in the natural setting, observing and interviewing people where they live and work and play. A fuller understanding can be developed through observations, face-to-face discussions, and participation in events. Now, complete observation, well, this is where the researcher systematically observes the social process but does not take part in it at all. The participant observation, well, the research collects information while participating in the life of the people. It's also referred to ethnography. The observation research can take place just about anywhere. Now, an unstructured interview is an extended, open-ended interaction between the interview and the interviewee, which enables the interviewer to learn more about the interviewee's life and thoughts. Now, you could look at secondary analysis of existing data. Using existing material and analyzing data originally collected by others, it's an unobtrusive means of which to do research. The sources can be data banks, books, magazines, newspaper, radio and television programs, personal documents, and internet sites. Triangulation uses several different research methods, data sources, investigators, and or even the theoretical perspective in the same study. Each method has its own strength and weaknesses, so many sociologists believe it's the best to combine multiple methods in a given study. We can also include the feminist research method. Feminist social scientists have been critical of traditional sociological research methodologies. Much of the research has been androcentric. You can check your textbook for that one. Sexist language or concepts are used, research methods which are biased in favor of men, research in which results that focus on members of one sex are used to support conclusions about both sexes. The way in which feminists use research methods is different. It's women-centered. The goals are to help women improve their situation and give a voice to women. And the researcher is seen as central to the research process rather than as an objective observer. Finally, there's the critical research strategies. And this is clinical research strategies dispute the neutrality of scientific approach. Some researchers feel that this neutral stance implicates the researchers in the dominant power struggle that creates and maintains injustice. Critical research strategies are rooted in the concern for social justice. Now, it could be oppositional. Researchers place themselves on the side of the marginalized or their critique structures that marginalize them. Or it could be radical, where researchers try to get to the roots of the dominance and explore the interconnections of, and for example, capitalism. Or it could be subversive, where researchers question the assumptions in order to open the door to alternative understandings of the social world. Now, we have to take in consideration ethical issues when it comes to research. There's a long history of the development of guidelines to protect the integrity and privacy and honor of people being studied. Sociologists must follow a number of basic ethical standards. Participation must be voluntary. No harm to the participants. Respect the rights of confidentiality and anonymity. Check out the examples provided in your text for some of the studies that raise questions regarding privacy. Humphrey's research, Magnotta and Ogden cases, and the issue ethics of big data. All right, there we are. We've completed week 2 and chapter 2. Good luck, everybody, and keep up the work.